welcome everybody to the TrojAI webinar series. Really excited for this week. We've got a great topic on the risk landscape of Agentic AI. And I am happy to be here today with Sumedh Barde. Sumedh is an experienced technology leader who is currently focused on actually using AI for security. So we will kind of talk about both security for AI and AI for security today, which is always fun. Sumedh's got a great background currently at Simbian, but previously was at Microsoft for a long time, working on things like cloud services and cloud security. For large organizations and many companies around the world. And Sumedh's really kind of at the nexus of this dynamic of using agentic AI as well as thinking about security use cases on top of that. So Sumedh, thanks for being here.
Very excited to be with you here, Lee, and talking about this topic.
Yeah, it should be fun. All right. Well, like I said, great topic this week. I think, some people, Sumedh, have said that 2025 is the year for agentic AI. We will see if that's true. There's been a lot of buzz around it, I'm sure, as you know.
It definitely is. I think over 2024, the amount of progress that was made with agentic AI was just amazing, really fast. I actually would not be surprised if by the end of this year, if you're not playing with agents, then you're missing out on something would be the mood.
Yeah, I think you might be right. Well, good. Well, let's dive into it. We got a little bit of content we'll talk through, and we'll just get right into it. We're going to start with just kind of helping people understand what agentic AI is. I think there is a little bit of just baselining the knowledge. We'll talk about risks with agentic AI, and we'll talk about mitigations. Then we'll just have a little chat about kind of what we think is going to happen in the future. And so let's just kind of level set on what agentic AI is, and maybe, Sumedh, you're kind of at the nexus of this. Maybe you can just give us a little perspective, what is agentic AI in kind of fundamental basic terms.
Yeah, so when ChatGPT burst on the scene and people finally realized, hey, AI is here, it's mainstream, the initial wave of how people used LLMs was they issued every command. That led to a whole rise of what we now know as copilots, where people didn't trust the AI enough, but it was useful. And they said, okay, let me create systems where the human can give one command at a time, get back the output. So the AI system isn't empowered to take any actions. It's just a consultant on the side. You, the human, are taking actions. The issue is that means your AI is running at the speed of humans.
Yeah.
And so over time, the inevitable happened, which is as trust built up, people are now building systems that are autonomous. They use AI underneath. They are taking actions, could be booking your vacation, could be solving security issues like what we are doing, could be addressing customer support issues or whatever. And it took a lot of work to build that level of trust, but we are at that point where now people are deploying these agents in production.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a ton of sense. I like your point about we're basically, copilots are great, applications are great that are using AI and Gen AI, but you're right, it's moving at the speed of humans. And I think the whole point of this is that we can dramatically increase productivity by enabling more automation. So that makes total sense. Yeah, let's look at. I've got a simple kind of diagram here. This actually is from an NVIDIA blog post. So, I think this is a very basic depiction of a little bit of Sumedh of what you're talking about, right? Like, okay, how do we kind of, if you think about some like these four phases around gathering data, and then using things like RAG to coordinate that data and augment that data, and then acting on that by executing things, and then having some learning. So, I think this. This is just a very simple depiction of kind of what you said on how to kind of enable some more agentic automation with AI. And you said this to me in the past that there's this notion of kind of this kind of basic diagram, right? But there's also invoking some traditional software. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that as well.
Yeah, so when people initially started building agents, it was a very thin layer over LLMs where, okay, I'm taking some user input to kick off and then just calling the LLMs to do it. And then many of the LLMs have built-in support to call other APIs. And so it's relatively easy to just say, hey, LLM, you do it all. Um, at that point, really, when you think about the large LLMs, they are trained pretty broadly, but they're not really experts in any given domain. They're like jack of all, master of none. If you want to solve real problems in any particular domain, you have to bring in a lot of domain knowledge. Now, certainly, one way you could do that is train your own LLMs with as much domain knowledge as possible. But the reality is that there are many, many, many things that LLMs alone just cannot do. Think about like why did functional languages never really kick off? Like imperative versus functional languages. There's just many, many things that you just cannot express in functional languages, right?
Right.
Same thing here. I mean, if you want to go take actions, you do have to bring in addition to LLMs, a fair amount of traditional programming. In fact, just 2 days ago, I saw some LinkedIn post interestingly that said agents are about 5% AI and 95% traditional software. And that might be an exaggeration. That might be true. Who knows? But it
Right.
is true. Like at least the agents we are building, there's a lot of just traditional software domain knowledge and using AI in all the right places.
Yeah.
And ultimately, the goal is to solve a user problem. Doesn't matter what the means are. So
Yeah.
yeah, the concept of agents can be an entire spectrum.
Yeah. Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, I think to your point, I think the interaction with agents with a lot of existing software solutions that are out there can really, supercharge a lot of current applications and a lot of current processes to really automate them. And so, we've always talked about this dynamic of like, hey, look, obviously, when we think about especially in enterprises and business technology transformation with AI, the innovation is amazing, right? And I think when you think about massive technological transformations for business, AI is clearly the next frontier and the current thing that is making an impact and will make a larger impact going forward. And frankly, agents will supercharge that to a degree. Um, and so the question is, though, like, we're here to talk about risks and some threats. And so before we get to that, we'll get to that in a second. But maybe Sumedh, given you're kind of at the precipice of this, maybe you can help us understand like some real world examples. There's a few here, right? Shopping assistants, of course. Actually, that's been around for a while. You mentioned customer support. Any other, and I know we'll talk a little bit more about kind of using agents to improve your cybersecurity program in a bit, but any other kind of examples you would talk about?
Yeah, one of the most exciting developments since AI became mainstream is drug development. Um, Looking at the interactions of proteins and drugs, and it's just basically there are just so many variables involved that using traditional modeling, it becomes a little bit of a brute force thing. And so with agents, you can start learning, hey, what's working, what's not working, using traditional AI methods, get better at it. And you can discover drugs for not like different use cases. And that's become actually a hot area for
Mm,
AI in general and then agents in particular as well.
yeah,
There are some that you mentioned here on the slide with fraud detection, for instance. Imagine like the amount of volume that these financial institutions receive.
yeah,
It's just impossible to hire enough people and preconceive every notion, every possible situation for which you can write software. So you have to have something that adapts, but at the same time, you cannot hire enough humans. What do you do? Well, AI agents are a good mix that can run at the speed of machines, can be adaptable like humans,
yeah,
and look at every single thing coming along. Um, One of my friends used to run a BPO, uh, back office stuff,
yeah,
and he's like, For me, my folks are doing pretty mundane stuff. And he was one of the early adopters of AI to just jump on board and build agents that just receive requests and just take care of them behind the scenes. And as far as the front office is concerned, they have no idea whether humans or AI are addressing. This is all happening autonomously. So in general, things where the customer does not need to know that there is a human on the other side.
Yeah. 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 It's a good point. I talked to a call center company 2 days ago, large. They do a lot of outsourced call center, and the investment they're making in Gen AI and agents is significant, to your point, to really drive that automation. And they're be able to deliver great value for their clients, really good experiences in NPS, ways to escalate from the assistant to a human, using a variety of agentic techniques. So I think it's a great example. So let's talk a little bit about the risks. And this, we'll talk through these in a bit of detail. This is actually there was a recent publication from OWASP, great organization, regarding sorry about that. Securing agents and looking at agentic AI threats. They just released this document, so I recommend anyone to go take a look at it. This is a bit of a summary of it, but when we think about these risks, kind of, I'll go through these in some level of detail. But it starts with data and memory integrity. I think memory is a really interesting area now with LLMs and with agents generally. I mean, there are risks around memory poisoning where attackers manipulate memory to bring false data in. There's also agent poisoning, where you can tamper with the communication channels between agents. And then there's cascading hallucination attacks that can generate, false information that can propagate through the system automatically. So you've got that kind of data and memory integrity set of risks. Then you've got the behavioral and control risks, which really are around things like manipulation, intent manipulations and hijacking, as well as kind of deceptive behaviors, and then rogue agents malicious AI agents that can operate outside of kind of normal procedures. And then we've got a lot of access and privilege exploits that can occur, right? Permissions and identity risks here. I think this is common across agentic systems as well as traditional LLM models. And then code attacks too. There's AI generated kind of execution to allow attackers to inject malicious code. And then impersonation and traceability, and of course, kind of human attacks can happen. And then lastly, a lot of these agentic systems, we just talked a little bit about them, do have human in loop dynamics. And so exposing that by potentially like using things like denial of service attacks to kind of overwhelm the humans can happen, as well as kind of resource overloads using denial of service attacks. And then manipulation, by manipulating or deceiving humans to take certain actions. So these are kind of 5 categories that, again, are summarized from this OWASP paper. I'd highly recommend it. There's more detail in that paper. But any comments on these risks, Sumedh, you would say?
Yeah, while these risks are rewinding back, traditional software systems had there were a number of popular threat modeling frameworks like Stride and Dirtless and Dread and so on. You could say that many of these risks are essentially variants of the same thing, in some way. They are a little more specific. Each of these gets parented to one of these categories. The very interesting thing that is happening with AI compared to traditional software, in traditional software, there was code and then there was data that you had to deal with. And modeling threats was relatively easy because of that clear separation, keeping aside the fact that there were many systems that mixed those two. With AI, that separation is changing. The line is blurred to the point where what is input and what is code is not sometimes clear. Your systems are taking input, treating that as prompts for the next set of things, and this gets really complicated as a result of that.
Yeah.
Um, and so I just wanted to comment for the fact that like while we call these unique risks, it's they are in some ways related to traditional models, but just significantly more complicated. You just have to accordingly evolve the way we deal with threat modeling and with putting the right defenses in place because of that reason.
Yeah, I do think that this, to your point, the the fact that the agentic systems tend to bring a good amount of automation into the process. There's a there's obviously challenges to your point, Sumedh, with kind of inputs and outputs of models and potential risks there. But this does, you know, increase isn't the right word, but it creates a cascading effect potentially due to the automation. And
Yep.
I think that is like as organizations think about their agentic systems and the architecture, um, you know, thinking about the risks that that can present is quite important. And while it sounds obvious, it's as one thinks about it is a little different.
Yeah, I mean, it's a double-edged sword also. Like, on the one hand, instead of exposing LLMs raw to end
Yes.
users who don't know how to use them well,
Yes.
if if you're buying an agent from a developer who really knows security well, then the benefit is that that person with their domain knowledge has made a rugged system. The LLMs are used in a responsible fashion, and you're
Yeah.
using a piece of software with a particular contract. So it can be a plus if used well,
Yeah. Yeah.
but does take significant amount of effort, both from the users as well as the buyers, to make sure that you're using these responsibly.
Yeah, I mean, in many ways, there's an opportunity for more control, right? Because as you said, when you think about a copilot or an application that interfaces with an LLM and allows user input to that LLM, there is a lot of opportunity for manipulation, for various prompt-based risks, right? And if you're with agentic systems, there is an opportunity to shape those prompts and
Exactly.
control those prompts,
Exactly.
which could be a very large benefit, frankly,
Yeah.
right? If done well, could be great.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, it's interesting to think about that. Um, all right, well, let's just talk a little bit about the risk mitigation. And so this is a fairly high level framework, um, but uh, but we'll talk through it. I mean, I think when we talk to enterprises and customers, one thing they do, regardless of whether it's agentic or just general AI security, is definition and governance is critical, right? Like think about your use cases. We talked about a bunch of those. What's the context of those use cases? What are the general risks of that content, that data, those applications, and consider that obviously in policy and governance around those applications and those models and any agentic system that has access to that, and evaluate controls and define those controls that you think are needed in that process. We are seeing a good amount of alignment towards various industry standard kind of frameworks and benchmarks. NIST has the AI RMF. There's ISO standards. OWASP has the top 10 and has a lot of activity in LLM uh, standards and kind of guidelines. And then MITRE's Atlas framework as well. So, I think really spending some time up front developing these policies. A lot of organizations today have built AI policies. Thinking about the impact that agentic systems could have to those policies is important. Um, I think that's a key piece of it. And then from there, how do we think about during development, testing, and validating? So, this goes from traditional, assessment of the code through a variety of disciplines to actually testing the agentic systems themselves, to testing the LLMs themselves, so that we can find the vulnerabilities. And we talk a lot here about behavioral testing, like looking at the actual behavior of the system and what happens, as well as the things like the governance of the permission layer and the software that makes up the models. All of those things need to be considered. And then at runtime, protecting and monitoring these things through detection and response solutions, through analyzing the data flows, through looking at the prompts themselves to make sure that you're aware of any threats. The other thing is that we are seeing more organizations consider moderation of certain content. I think Agentic might give you opportunities to control that more, but also probably for that to be exploited through a cascading effect. So I think content moderation continues to be something to think about at runtime for sure. And then integration with your other controls, right? With the SOC, typically we see the SOC. A lot of times we see the application security team as well being engaged here, given the fact that these are applications that you may be rolling out in your environment. And then, we've got an example here, and I think, Sumedh, you talked about healthcare and pharma being a pretty interesting opportunity for agentic. Um, you know, uh, Building an autonomous radiology assistant that automatically can help somebody that is looking at radiology results or executing against them. So, make sure that you look at things like HIPAA, obviously in this case, and NIST is critical for the medical industry, and then understanding those, getting like inventory of those risks, and then providing mitigation controls and remediation in place, and of course monitoring that on an ongoing basis. So any thoughts here on mitigation of this, those risks that we talked about previously, Sumedh?
I would just say that as a developer, Agentic AI is an amazing tool. But as you can see on the slide, there's a significant amount of effort you have to put in as a developer to make sure you secure it. And I'm glad folks like you are doing the work you're doing, excellent work, to take some of that away into a tool. I mean, clearly the things you have to do go across the entire framework of identify, protect, detect, respond. And so you do need to think about all of those factors.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, no, I think yeah, I think the good news is that there's a lot of disciplines we can call on in cybersecurity that we've been doing for, 30 years. And then there's some new aspects of that, right? The new attack surface dynamics around LLMs generally, and then around the automation of LLMs using agents. But there's obviously good frameworks that can be applied. I think it's more about the nuance of the kind of attack surface itself that changes and evolves, and how we think to mitigate that and manage that. Um, so yeah, so I think maybe what we can talk about next, Sumedh, is given again your experience with agentic AI, is like go a little deeper on an example of using agentic AI for cybersecurity. So we, as a company, we're a company focused on securing AI models and applications. We are now going to like talk about using AI for cybersecurity operations, slightly different than we usually do, Sumedh. So we're glad to have you here to talk through that. And so maybe you can walk us through uh, using agentic AI to improve your security operations, which I know you're doing a lot of work in.
Absolutely. Happy to walk you through an example and how these two things relate to each other. What you're seeing on the screen right now is a scenario we set out to solve. Every big company has what's called a security operations center, a SOC. Their goal is to take security alerts from a number of systems. Most companies have SIMs and XDRs and EDRs and CSPMs and a bunch of these sources. Each of these detection systems is looking at some slice of the enterprise and saying, that plus that plus that together indicates something may be wrong. And they cannot tell for sure that it is wrong, but they raise an alert that something may be wrong. And then there is an army of people. And as you can see, they're usually understaffed, overwhelmed with the number of alerts coming their way, whose goal is to look at these alerts and then determine, are these true or was this just a false alarm? That's part one. But part two is, if it was true, then how bad is it? What other damage happened? What is the full scope of damage? And then three is, before, if it was true, then before things escalate, what can I do to contain There might be a potential attack happening here. What can I, maybe there is a user who's under attack. Let me go quarantine that user. Maybe force a step up in authentication or something like that, or block an IP address. So for this area in general, there are 500,000 open jobs apparently in security operations just in the US alone, not even worldwide. There just aren't enough people in the world who are trained to do this job. And so we set out to solve this one and said, okay, what if, just what if that entire problem could be outsourced to AI that can autonomously do what people have been doing in this? Now, it doesn't mean that they can do everything that humans can do, but at least if they can take up 80, 90% of what humans can do, that will be fantastic. Now, when you think about this, everything Lee talked about until this point about securing AI itself becomes super critical. Here we are trying to make a company secure. If you're using AI to do that and the AI itself is not secure, you are making a bad problem worse. And let me illustrate that. Just click one more. To make such a system happen, what needs to happen under the hood? This kind of AI framework, and humans used to do that. Now it's AI, needs to be able to talk to a ton of systems. It needs to talk to your threat intelligence. It needs to talk to your entire environment to understand like what's the state of your Active Directory, your M365, AWS, and so on. It needs to talk to your people. In our case, our AI framework even takes in what I call investigation guides from you, which tell how things were done in your organization. So these are natural language guides that we can take from you and then consume that and do our work. We can send Slack messages to your or emails to your people to understand, hey, we saw some activity from your computer. Was that really you? What happened? And of course, we are talking to LLMs. What could go wrong? Well, tons of things could go wrong. Number one is that's the star on the left. This is a software system. So everything that could go wrong with a traditional software system could go wrong here as well. The denial of service attacks, integrity attacks, there could be elevation of privilege attacks, there could be buffer overruns, all that. Two, and that's the arrow coming down to LLMs. We are using LLMs. So every risk that Lee talked about with LLMs applies here potentially. There could be prompt injection attacks, there could be hallucinations, there could be just incorrect output, and we are just over relying on it. Like Lee had positioned that entire OWASP set of risks, all of them could go wrong there. 3, 4, and 5. Number 3 and 4, we are taking input from people that's in natural language. Those people could be malicious. There are sometimes insider threats. They could feed bad input to us, which leads us off on a tangent. And at the rate at which we run, it could be cascading into a huge amount of damage. 5 is the SOC analyst in the past and the AI agent in this case needs to take action. Like I said, maybe if a user is under attack, quarantine that user. If we are seeing lots of traffic, malicious traffic from an IP address, block that IP address, and so on. Those steps could get completely off the rails if any of the previous things ended up deluding the SOC agent into taking that. So lots and lots of risks could happen over here. Now, one more click, Lee. To tackle this, there was a multi-pronged thing we had to do. Number one is it's a software system. So do the traditional threat model. Could be Stride, could be Dirtless, could be Dread. For folks not familiar with Stride, it's a fairly like, I think, 20, 30-year-old model now that goes over every single input and output from your system and checks it for, like, you evaluate it for, like, could there be a spoofing attack? Could be a tamper attack? Is there a repudiation attack? Is there any information disclosure possible through this, and denial of service and so on? So we had to do that across our entire system. That's part one. Part two is when we use LLMs, just the act of using LLMs creates a bunch of risks. One great example is um, we might be leaking information to LLMs, like PII data. So now everything that Lee talked about applies over here. Um, we could use off-the-shelf framework. In our case, we had started the work fairly early. We have lots of SMEs on the team, so we built a bunch of in-house stuff over here. We call that trusted LLM. So we have a layer that makes sure that any LLM usage goes through that layer. The other thing that we did there was we host the LLMs. So it's not like we're just using the SaaS LLM from OpenAI or Anthropic or something. By doing that, we make sure that this doesn't leak out to another provider. The data stays within our control from that perspective. No data is fed into training, it's inference time only. So that way it makes sure the data doesn't leak into other things. So the number of things that we did there. But finally, it's also important to model what your app does with all of that output of the LLM. So in this particular case, as an example, imagine if one of the people figured out that think of an example of maybe Joe logged in from a couple of different places, like from Tokyo and New York within 5 minutes. And now we are investigating that. So we send mail to a colleague of Joe or Joe's manager saying, hey, do you know if Joe's traveling? Is this legit? Turns out this person is a rogue insider and then says, um, yes, but then adds, just like SQL injection, adds some text at the end that our LLM then takes. And unfortunately, it triggers a prompt injection at that point. Things can go really off the wire. And then what we would do is end up taking a response that we're not supposed to do, maybe deleting the user or who knows, sending mail to a bunch of other users and so on. So lots of things can go wrong over there. So one other thing that we end up doing over here is that there is a lot of firewalling between every single part of this framework. What I'm calling an agent here, by the way, is not one agent. Underneath that, there is an entire agentic framework, lots of little agents doing very specialized tasks. Agents focused on communication, agents focused on reading alerts, agents focused on figuring out what the right response should be, agents focused on understanding threat intelligence, and so on. And there's a lot of firewalling between them to make sure that the output of each of them, there is a traditional software layer that extracts structured data, passes it on to the next one. So that way, we don't let we contain any risks of one thing just to that and don't let it cascade over to the next side. And so that required knowledge of how our code itself runs. So that's the app specific risk, number 3 in that category. So it required all 3 of them. At this point, it's working great. My only point here is that, like building an agent, you do need to think about all 3 of these. And yes, you absolutely, it's not for the faint of heart. You should absolutely use any existing frameworks that you can get from the market, like what Lee's company does, Troj, for the number 2 aspect of it. But in addition to that, it's important for you to also think through your own application use cases and see what additional defense in depth you can add at your layer. So.
Yeah, that's great, Sumedh. Really, really interesting perspective from like a real world scenario. Both, yeah, I like how you combine the notion of like what you're building is for this for cybersecurity teams, and then you talked about how you secured it. It's awesome. Um, so yeah, we do have a couple questions that we'll get to in a second. Just real quick, as Sumedh mentioned, TrojAI, we're a company focused on helping organizations deploy AI securely, whether that's agentic or non-AI systems. We have a platform that tests models during build time, and we protect models at runtime. But let's talk about let's get to some questions because we got a few. If anyone has any questions in the Q&A section of Zoom, feel free to type those in, and we'll get to as many as possible. So Sumedh, here's the first one, which is a really good question from somebody. I'll summarize a bit. It's about the fact that financial services organizations have a low risk tolerance, given the regulatory requirements that financial services companies have. How can organizations go about defining whether an agentic workflow is safe for a production environment? That, speaking from context of previous AI incidents, as an example, a user convincing a car dealership to sell them a car for $1. I think we all know about that one. There are other examples like that. And so Sumedh, I'll be curious to get your take, but I mean, I think briefly what we tend to see is that uh, thinking, like I said, holistically about governance and policy initially, but then when you think about making sure that it's safe for production, I think it really is around like testing um, many aspects of that system prior to production and then protecting it at runtime at a high level. But Sumedh, maybe you can comment a little bit more specifically because you literally just went through this. Any advice or guidance there?
Yeah, a mental model I like to use is agents are trying to, in some ways, mimic what humans have done just at the speed of software. So, as a financial firm, you do hire people. How do you end up trusting those people? How do you give them responsibility? How do you make sure that they don't do tremendous damage? That happens, right? So, what do you do? Like, initially, you do your research, make sure there are background checks, all of that to make sure that even before even before the employee is hired, there is already some level of diligence done. Same thing here. I mean, if you are buying an agent from a third party or building your own, the reputation of the vendor who built it, the amount of adoption, the you asking them questions. Hey, um, just you're depending on the vendor, so you're asking them questions like, "What have you done around this risk, this risk, this risk?" They just presented that slide with all of the risks. Ask them straight on, like, "What have you done?" And if you're not getting convincing answers, that's probably a yellow flag right there. Um, so that is part one, like just due diligence. But then what do you do after you onboard the employee? Well, in the very first week, you don't give them access to all your systems. You give them a little bit of access, you ramp them up. It's
Right.
you're kind of on probation for some time. That's what you would do with agents as well. Test them out, pilot them in very contained environments, making sure that even if damage is done, it's very little. And then finally, at some point, again, coming back to the employee, as the employee ramps up after 6 months, they're getting full privilege probably to entire systems. But that doesn't mean that you can completely take your eyes off. There's always going to be checks and balances. Same thing here. You're onboarding agents in your company. You have to think about what your checks and balances are. Let's say an agent um, does have a bug, like despite the best efforts of the vendor and you, all software has issues, every human has issues, agents will have issues as well. Something goes off the rails. What do you do? Can you turn that off quickly? Can you undo things quickly? Do you have backups of the previous system? Exact same things apply. This is not new. It's just working at a different scale, is what I would
Yeah.
say.
Yeah, that's great. No, that's great. Great perspective. All right, we've got quite a few coming in, which is awesome. So keep them coming. Um, so this is an interesting question, Sumedh. So someone's asking, do do we feel like it could be valuable to first explore using a copilot and then moving towards more automated workflows using agentic systems to work out, potential issues with kind of human intervention first? I would say, and you should comment too, Sumedh, like when we talk to our customers and just other people in the market that are building AI, applications for their business, we typically see that copilots are something that people deploy, first because it's a way to get value kind of quickly, depending on what you're trying to solve. And so we do see that. I think it, is that if you think about like crawl, walk, run analogies, is that crawl? It might be. Walk could be more, getting more towards agentic. How do you think about that, Sumedh? Just like broadly when you think about enterprise AI adoption?
I don't know. Like, if your intent was to buy a fully autonomous Tesla, would you test drive a bicycle first to be
Fair
comfortable
point.
with that?
Yeah, fair point.
They're just very different.
Yeah, they are good. Yeah,
You're trying to solve very different problems with a copilot and with agents. The kinds of risk profiles are completely different. Yes, both of them use AI, just like both the Tesla and the bicycle both have wheels,
right.
but they are just different systems completely. I mean, if your intent is to make something fully autonomous, embrace that, put the right checks and balances from that perspective.
Yeah.
Everything you did with Copilot is not going to just automatically transition over. It's like in the before this, I was at Microsoft at the beginning of like when Azure was just taking off, AWS was just taking off. It was interesting. People were like taking existing on-premises software and
Yeah.
trying to run that as is in the cloud.
Yes.
And they were just missing the bigger picture of the cloud enables an entirely different category of things.
Yeah.
Um, don't do that, I would say.
No, it's actually a really good point, Sumedh, because to your point, it's a great analogy, right? Like it was a difference between lift and shift and cloud native, right? And what we saw from cloud native was a massive innovation unlock, and lift and shift was more about efficiency, operations, maybe a little bit of cost savings, right? So it's a good point that like agentic as opposed to like more copilot mode, they are very different. I think that's a really good
And
point.
both of them have their place just
Yeah,
for different scenarios.
right. They're different. Yeah,
I'm not saying that one is better than the other. For some scenarios, agentic is way better. Some scenarios, Copilot is way better. It's just
yeah, it
pick your
is.
scenario and then go for it, embrace it.
Yeah. Yeah, so okay, great. Here's another question. Sumedh described LLMs as kind of jack of all trades. We talked about this, Sumedh, right? Like large multi-billion parameter models are jack of all trades. Like, do you think we're going to see the rise of smaller, specialized models in agentic AI? And like, would that make you think differently about securing those things? Like, if we think about small language models?
It's already happening. For all the hype that we see about, let's say, DeepSeek and like the latest frontier models coming out, what goes unnoticed in the news is just how prevalent Meta's Llama is.
Yes.
The reason why you don't hear about it directly is because tons of people are customizing, fine-tuning it,
Yep.
quantizing it, fine-tuning it, creating their own variants. So they're using some variant of it, not the original one as is. But that's exactly what they're doing. I mean, they are banks are there are financial firms sitting on a bunch of really good training data.
Yes.
They're creating customized versions for their own purpose. Um, Even within our own system, as an example, we're not using one LLM, we're using multiple LLMs. And then there are some tasks for which you really don't need the power of a 170 or like 500 billion parameter model. Like sometimes
Yeah.
it's just a matter of, okay, I just want to get IP addresses out of that block of text.
Right.
That doesn't require a whole lot of intelligence, right?
Yeah.
So we do use specialized small models in specific parts of it as well.
Yeah. Yeah, no, yeah, we see that too as well. We see the rise of small language models a bit more. We use them internally at TrojAI for our solutions. Yeah, I mean, I think it makes a lot of sense. I think security for them is not too dissimilar to how to think about LLMs. I mean, the context in which they operate maybe allows you to secure them in a more uh, like a little more targeted way, but I think generally it's not that much different. Okay, we're going to take one more question because we're at about 45 minutes here. And it's a follow-up, Sumedh, to something you said. So the question is really around, you were talking about third-party AI, either applications or agents, and you mentioned this concept of like the responsibility of the vendor as opposed to the responsibility of the customer. Like, how do you think about that? This is a classic third-party risk management discussion now, but like when you think about that in context of these AI applications and agents, how should people think about the vendor responsibility for the versus the customer responsibility?
Um, the agent at the end of the day is a piece of software. The fact that it uses LLMs under the hood is an implementation detail. In that sense, the agent that you're using, there is a certain expectation of what you feed it, what your environment feeds it, and what you get out of it. Um, Making sure that contract is honored is certainly the vendor's responsibility. Now, expressing that contract can be hard, um, but making sure that the outputs are like when you benchmark the outputs of the agent, they would be what a human would do is the agent's responsibility in that sense.
Yeah.
Now, on the other hand, just like humans make mistakes, and sometimes you cannot even tell if it's a mistake or it's vague. The contract is vague in those sense. Same things will happen with agents as well. And making sure that you defend the rest of your environment from it, it's something that you still have to do in terms of defense in depth. Don't
Yeah.
expect that the agent will be 100% right always. Right? So
Yeah.
like we saw the CrowdStrike incident back in July.
Right.
Despite their best intent, things went off. And frankly, like things like that happen. Companies have to have the defense in depth around any third-party software that they buy. So,
Yeah. No, that's great. Really appreciate it. Yeah. So, really appreciate your participation here, Sumedh. It was a great discussion. Before we go, though, uh, and I'll put you on the spot a little bit. I don't think we talked about this beforehand, but I think you probably have a lot of opinions. What do you think 2025? What's your prediction for 2025 around the use of agents in AI? What do you think is going to happen?
last year in 2024, every customer that we talked to, what I found most interesting was it was not the traditional thing, hey, I have a use case that needs to be solved. That was there as well. But pretty much every customer said, well, I'm under pressure from my board to use AI for something. So there was that push. I
Yeah.
expect the same thing to translate to now. Are you offloading to agents where you can? Are you autonomous enough? And so I expect by the end of 2025, certainly every company will have agents somewhere in some nook or cranny of their company, for sure. I, in fact, expect if things go really well, I mean, I expect there will be some mishaps along the way that will cause people to step back and like, is it right? We'll make progress through it. The industry will progress. I expect 2026, could be even 2025, there'll be the second order things coming up. Just like people, agents need identities. So there'll be identity management software for agents.
Yeah.
There will be like background checks for agents, and all the derivative industries coming after agents will start happening at some point.
Yeah.
Maybe closer to 2026, but you'll start seeing some of the early works in that in 2025 itself.
Yeah, that's great. I think that will be quite fascinating when that happens. Well, this is a good way to wrap it up, Sumedh. Thank you so much for taking the time and being here with us today. We appreciate it. I think it was a great session. As always, we run these monthly for anybody that wants to continue to participate. The next one will be roughly 30 days from now. We look forward to continuing to talk to you and continuing the conversation about securing AI for the enterprise. Thank you, and thanks, Sumedh, for joining. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Lee, for having me over. Great discussion.
Yep. Have a good one, everybody. We'll talk to you soon.
Bye.